In today's political landscape, the word treason, or the accusation of a person committing a treasonous act, is sometimes thrown around or sensationalized in the media. But treason is a heavy-handed charge. In the eyes of the law, it's a very serious accusation and is a capital indictment that comes with a hefty punishment of imprisonment or, in some cases, death. During the 16th century, King Henry VIII of England widely used the law to behead several subjects who did not fall into place under his reign. He also had two of his own wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, beheaded under accusations of treason and adultery. Today, however, the use of treason is an extremely rare occurrence in the U.S. But what exactly is the legal definition of treason? How is it applicable in modern law?
As a general matter, treason refers to the betrayal of one's country, and so every country in the world has some form of treason law to punish the people who betray it. Our Constitution actually defines the crime of treason. It's the only crime specifically defined in the document, and it's limited to cases of levying war against the United States or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort.
That's historian and professor Carlton Larson. He's a scholar of American constitutional law and legal history at the University of California, Davis School of Law. He's also the author of the new book, On Treason, A Citizen's Guide to the Law. Larson shares that the narrow expanse of treason is cemented in our Constitution and was strictly defined by our nation's founding fathers. Because of this written directive, the law can never be updated or expanded by Congress or any other political body. Larson also adds that any act of treason must be intentional, and what many often see as treasonous instead falls under the wider umbrella of espionage.
I think the biggest misconception is that any interaction with a foreign country or assistance to a foreign country is treason, and that's just simply not the law. What the treason clause forbids assistance to enemies, and enemies has a very precise meaning under treason law, and that is it's foreign nations or groups with whom we are in a state of open war. And so it doesn't apply to foreign countries generally. And that means that many cases of disloyalty, such as, say, passing secrets to the Soviet Union, like the Rosenbergs did in the 1950s, can't be prosecuted as treason. Now, it can still be punished for something else. In the Rosenbergs case, they were convicted on espionage charges. But I think that's sort of the biggest misconception, and people can do a lot of bad things in terms of passing American secrets to foreign countries without technically being guilty of treason. Now, we might colloquially call them traitors, and they clearly are people who betrayed their country, but they haven't technically committed the crime of treason against the United States.
For example, take the case of Edward Snowden, a former CIA employee and contractor for the National Security Agency. Back in 2013, he released confidential government documents to the press in an effort to expose extensive government surveillance programs of the public. Since the news broke, Snowden has been labeled as a conspirator, a criminal, and a traitor. Larson notes that while his actions were unlawful, they still don't fall under what constitutes as treason.
I think he did was quite harmful to national security, and it was clearly unlawful. But what he did in terms of leaking secrets, he leaked them to media. Now, if he'd handed them over to, say, the Taliban or to ISIS, then maybe there would be a case of treason, but he didn't do that. Now, it's also true that Taliban and the ISIS now have access to this, but that seems to be an entirely indirect consequence of what he was doing. That is, he didn't intend to aid those enemies, and under the decided cases, you have to actually intend to aid the enemy. And it doesn't seem that Snowden wanted to do that. What he wanted to do was expose what he saw as serious wrongdoing.
Ultimately, the U.S. did charge Snowden with espionage. So who has actually been indicted under acts of treason? Larson points to one case in recent history that brought about this rare charge. In 2006, a California man named Adam Gadon was charged with treason after joining terrorist group Al-Qaeda and with clear intent supplying material and translation services to this known enemy of the U.S. Larson says that in this case, the government could move forward with the charge because there were physical witnesses to his actions.
The Constitution requires two witnesses to the same overt act. And that can be somewhat difficult to procure in just any ordinary crime. But with modern treason, much of which happens say, electronically, it would be very hard to have two witnesses. So even if you did think, for example, that Edward Snowden had committed treason, how would you have two witnesses to the same overt act of what he did? It would actually be quite hard. And so that poses a real burden to prosecutors. And so in many of these cases, even if a treason charge might be appropriate, they'll conclude that they just can't meet the two-witness requirement, and then we'll naturally have to rely on other charges instead.
In the case of Gadon, he remained a wanted criminal for several years until his death in 2015. He was confirmed killed in Pakistan by a series of targeted U.S. drone strikes. Ultimately, these examples hopefully showcase that the definition of treason is a very narrow window in modern times. So, what does the future hold for the law?
My guess is that we will see relatively few treason prosecutions. I think that's probably a good thing. Hopefully people aren't committing treason left and right. But, it's still out there, and possibly with new types of terrorism, new types of levying war, it will have to adapt and accommodate to a new age. So it's certainly not something that's entirely for the history books, but something that we'll need to think about carefully going forward.
Larson hopes that his new book helps regular people better understand the law of treason. It's not a charge that should be taken lightly by any means.
I find the rhetoric really quite disturbing. It's just people just tossing around the term treason very casually, and we've seen that with President Trump, who has accused Joe Biden and Barack Obama of treason. And this is an extraordinary thing. I mean, this is the highest crime known to the law. It's a capital crime. And for a president to accuse a former president and his current political rival of that crime is absolutely extraordinary. And it's utterly without any legal basis whatsoever. And so I really wish that we could dial the temperature down and not be living in a political world where all of one's enemies are somehow mutated into traitors.
To find out more about this topic and our guest, Professor Carlton Larson, head to viewpointsradio.org. You can also check out Larson's new book, On Treason, A Citizen's Guide to the Law, available online and in bookstores. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
If you go back a decade, the thought that you could get something delivered to your doorstep in a day or two after you ordered it was pretty much unthinkable.
Exploring the competitive e-commerce space. Then,
she would flutter her fan according to the Morse code dots and dashes. If one of her spies was watching, they would be able to read the Morse code dot and dashes that she was doing with her fan.
Uncovering the stories of fearless women on both sides of the fight during the Civil War. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows. And find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.